All right. Hey, everybody, and welcome back to Paradigm Sherpas. I'm extremely honored to introduce today's guest and Paradigm Sherpa, Richard Gage. Richard Gage, AIA, is an architect of 30 years from the San Francisco Bay Area, a member of the American Institute of Architects, and the founder and former CEO of Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth, now independent. He, along with his courageous wife, Gail, continues to lead the charge towards a real investigation into the destruction of all three World Trade Center skyscrapers on 9/11 at richardgage911.org. Mr. Gage became interested in researching the destruction of the World Trade Center high rises after hearing the startling conclusions of a reluctant 9/11 researcher, David Ray Griffin, on the radio in 2006, which launched his own unyielding quest for the truth about 9/11. The organization he founded, AE 9/11 Truth, now numbers more than 3,500 architects and engineers, demanding a new investigation into the destruction of all three World Trade Center high rise buildings on 9/11. And with that, it's my pleasure to welcome Richard Gage, AIA architect.
Hi
Hey,
guys.
Richard.
Hey Ryan. How you doing?
I'm great. I really appreciate you jumping on today and being willing to catch up with us and enlighten everybody as to the work you've been doing tirelessly for a number of years. So thank you very much for being here.
The honor is mine. I'm looking forward to bringing this information to your audience. It's really important, and I think it will aid significantly in waking up America and saving our country and maybe the world. That's how important the awareness of the explosive demolition of these three skyscrapers is.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And for me, it was so imperative that I got you on here for exactly those reasons. I think that personally, I believe that uncovering the truth of that terrible day and the events will have a healing and meaningful impact on how we as citizens, Americans, carry forward our lives and how our government acts out in the world. So, just maybe for background, for your benefit as to why I wanted to reach out and how I got into this. It was actually a study I believe you helped fund and make happen. University of Fairbanks, Alaska, um, did I believe like a multi-year study on the collapse of World Trade Center 7. I was in fifth grade, excuse me, sixth grade when the World Trade Centers collapsed. My dad was actually in an airplane. I was terrified, very confused about the events, and certainly accepted the mainstream narrative I saw on TV for a number of years until I came across that study, and it opened me up to your work. And I don't think a lot of people know about World Trade Center 7 in particular. Certainly, the Twin Towers are present in everyone's mind. But I'm wondering if maybe today, for the viewers, you could take us down a path where we explore World Trade Center 7 first, and then we could talk about the Twin Towers as well.
You bet. Let's do it. And we don't want your audience or any other audience to be the last to know about 9/11. I felt like I was the last to know in 2006 when I first heard this information, as you mentioned, from David Ray Griffin. I was simply shocked, like you were, about the destruction of not only two skyscrapers, which didn't make any sense, but also the third tower that came down. In fact, most people know nothing about the third tower. I'm one of 90,000 members of the American Institute of Architects, and we didn't get one bulletin on this, the third worst structural failure in modern history after the Twin Towers. So we've got to look at it, right? I mean, this should have been the most studied structural failure in history because no plane hit this building, right? Well, I mean, it was only half the height of the Twin Towers at the time it was built, but still, it would be the tallest building in most of our states. It's 47 stories tall. It is a skyscraper in its own right. Twin Towers were were the highest buildings in the world when they were built. But here's the tower standing majestically before 9/11. It's about 100 yards from the North Tower. And again, it was not hit by a plane. It survived the collapse of the Twin Towers just fine. It had a few columns that had ejected out of the Twin Towers, which we'll get to, that hit the Tower 7 on the south side. But this was not a significant factor in the building's collapse, as NIST says. And NIST is the National Institute of Standards and Technology, who was tasked by Congress to explain these collapses to the American people. So what happened? Let's take a look. On the upper left, we see the eastbound penthouse has come down, and then in an isolated event, and then 7 seconds later, this happens. The entire building drops straight down uniformly, symmetrically into its own footprint. How? Let's listen to NIST's Shyam Sunder, the project leader of this massive effort that Congress tasked NIST with to explain to the American people what happened to these three towers. Regarding Building 7, he says this.
What we found was that uncontrolled building fires caused an extraordinary event. The collapse of World Trade Center 7 was primarily due to fire.
Okay, fires. Well, let's look at those fires. These are the worst fires that we have photographic or video evidence of in the building. They're few, they're small, and they're scattered. And they're burned out over an hour before that building collapsed. So it was not raging. These are raging fires. We've had dozens and dozens of much hotter, larger, and longer lasting fires in these types of buildings before 9/11. Not one of them has collapsed. Nor after 9/11. We have much hotter, larger, and longer lasting fires in these buildings. Not one of them has collapsed either. No steel frame, fire protected structure has ever collapsed due to fire. So what happened then? Let's compare Building 7 on the left, its collapse, with a series of known controlled demolitions on the right. Is there any similarity? Is there enough similarity to warrant an investigation, at least, into the possible use of explosives to bring down the building in a controlled demolition, especially since it looks exactly like a controlled demolition, especially since fire, the official cause of this building's collapse, has never in history brought down a steel frame fire protected structure. So we got to learn something here. And we did, starting with David Ray Griffin, who laid out the characteristic features of controlled demolition, typical controlled demolition. So we can see, is there any similarity to any of these features or all of them? Let's begin with feature number 1, a sudden onset of destruction. Let's listen to Dan Rather that afternoon, 5:20 p.m. New York time.
What you're seeing are high shots. Now, here we're going to show you a videotape of the collapse itself.
Describe that.
Now we go to videotape the collapse of this building.
It's amazing.
Amazing, incredible, pick your word. For the third time today, it's reminiscent of those pictures we've all seen too much on television before, when a building was deliberately destroyed by well-placed dynamite to knock it down.
What was that, Dan? Destroyed by well-placed dynamite to knock down. Well, he's using his intuition, right? I mean, we all should. Unfortunately, he never talked about this mystery, how normal office fires could bring down a building like this for the first time ever. Nor have we seen this building's collapse on mainstream media, nor did the American Institute of Architects, again, give even one bulletin about it to their membership. Do we have a straight down symmetrical collapse into its own footprint? Let's look from West Street. Pretty straight down, pretty symmetrical. Hey, How do you do that? You've got to remove all 24 core columns at once within an instant, a fraction of a second of each other, followed about a second later by the perimeter columns, and repeat that on each floor. And that sequence of events brings it down symmetrically and drops the exterior perimeter structure over the interior, which is falling on each floor a second before it. So how does that happen with these fires? This is not explained, of course, in the final NIST report of 2007, 2008, which happened 7 years after 9/11. They're juggling this football, saying, Shyam Sunder saying, we really have trouble getting a handle on this. Well, yeah, because you were lying 6 ways from Sunday, as we will continue to show. How fast did the building come down, for instance? For instance, it came down at free fall acceleration for at least a third of its 7-second fall, as documented by David Chandler, a physics teacher, and others, including NIST, which was forced into admitting that it did, in fact, come down at free fall after denying for 6 years that it came down at free fall. They denied that, saying, oh gosh, if that would mean there'd be no structure underneath it. Yeah, when you finally admit it, what happened to the structure? What happened to the 40,000 tons of structural steel such that it could fall as fast as a bowling ball falling out of the sky, which is at free fall? It's getting faster and faster and faster every second. The definition of acceleration. Well, you have to remove those columns. Where did they go? What happened to them? NIST has no reference to this whatsoever. They simply acknowledge what's obvious. Is there the total dismemberment of the structural steel frame? Feature number 5 of typical controlled demolition. Yeah, we have a 47-story moment-resisting steel-framed skyscraper falling like a house of cards, as if that structure was just completely dismembered. 4 or 6 stories tall. Should have been a massive structure, like these structures, for instance, which fall due to natural events, in these cases, earthquakes, where the building is recognizable as a building. There's certainly damage, but the columns and beams are not severed one from another. The concrete is not pulverized to a fine powder. Well, what could have caused that? Well, do we have witnesses of explosions? Let's listen to Daryl, a medical student interviewed that evening.
We were watching the building actually because it was on fire. The bottom floors of the building were on fire, and we heard this sound that sounded like a clap of thunder. Turned around, we were shocked to see that the building was, it looked like there was a shock wave ripping through the building, and the windows all busted out, and it was horrifying. And then, about a second later, the bottom floor caves out, and the building followed after that, and we saw the building crash down all the way to the ground.
Okay, that's very helpful. A clap of thunder. How about Kevin McPadden, former Air Force medic, on hand? What did he experience?
You heard explosions, like boom. It's like a distinct sound. It's not like when in compression, like boom, 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 like floors that were dropping and collapsing. This was boom, and like you felt a rumble in the ground, like almost like you wanted to grab onto something. That, to me, I knew that was an explosion. There was no doubt in my mind.
No, nor the mind of Bill Rosati, who's interviewed here.
I was standing like 2 blocks away, and all of a sudden I just seen a big flash, and then I seen the building coming down, and I just seen people just running everywhere. Chaos.
A big flash and then the building coming down. How about Captain Richard Patterson of the FDNY?
1-7 let go as well, and was also similar with, although not as loud because I was further away, a series of concussive explosions.
That's helpful. How about Patrick Dillon, first responder?
I remember feeling that, like it was like freight trains underneath the earth, shaking the earth, even shaking me. That's when we all saw Building 7 crumple in the middle, like way up at the top. It buckled, and then dropped.
And that's helpful too. Well, do we have any foreknowledge of this building's collapse? Here's the department chief, Nick Visconti. We're moving the command post over this way. That building's coming down. And then here goes 7. It started to come down, and now people were starting to run. And this chief, Pete Hayden, asks an anonymous engineer, if we allow it to burn, could we anticipate a collapse, and how soon? It turned out he was pretty much right on the money. In its current state, you have about 5 hours. Wait a minute. Here's an engineer announcing the completely unprecedented event of a building collapsing due to fire, according to the official narrative, which has never happened, but he gets it right on the money. 5 hours you have. So the fires were out before the collapse. In fact, the prediction could only have been made with foreknowledge, of course. We don't get the name of this engineer. He's anonymous. How about these mysterious construction workers walking away from Building 7, hearing an explosion over their shoulder, looking back at the building, and then looking straight into the CNN camera and saying this.
Keep your eye on that building. It'll be coming down.
The building is about to blow up. Moving back.
All right, guys. Sorry.
We are looking back. There's a building about to blow up. On flame. Debris coming down.
A building is about to blow up. How do they know a building that has a few small scattered fires is about to blow up? Flame and debris coming down. They knew it. So what do we do about that? Let's go to witnesses to give us some more insight into what happened before it came down. Maybe that'll give us a clue.
All right. And he pointed to what turned out to be the entrance to Building 7's lobby. He said, go in there, take a break. There's other guys in there, like that. And that's what I did. I finished coming down off the pile and climbed over the wreckage of Vesey, and went in those revolving doors and just kind of fell on the floor. There were other guys in there doing the same thing I was, just shaking their heads and spitting out poison and trying to get their lungs back together again, as I was. And I was on the floor. These battalion chiefs come in through the revolving doors. There was 3 of them. They had the white helmets. I didn't get any IDs off them. But as soon as they stepped inside, what stepped in behind them were these 2 people in black with black ski masks on, and Uzis. And the Uzis were hanging off their necks. And I don't know what they were or who they were, but the battalion chiefs started yelling at us, right, ordering us to get out of this building. They're going to pull the building. Everybody out now. And they ordered us back out.
They're going to pull the building. Pull it is a term used in the controlled demolition industry. This is getting really strange, this mystery. What was the foreknowledge that Captain Richard Patterson experienced?
So he and I made our way over to the entrance of the building. Before we arrived there was a construction worker who happened to be, he emerged from the dust cloud and walked past the chief and I. And he said he had overheard the chief's comment, and he paused and said, that'll be coming down around 5 o'clock.
What?
We part ways. We arrive at 7, and there were 2 paramilitarily clad men with black rifles, sunglasses, And as we approached the entrance, they closed ranks and said, one of them said, "This building has been secured," which is odd because in my experience in the FDNY, anybody preventing access to the fire department in the event of a fire, that's a criminal act. The chief and I were not in a position to argue the point, given the inequality in weaponry present.
So this is really interesting. Who are these two different sets of thugs? The first one's in ski masks and Uzis. The second one with longer rifles, beige outfits, as Captain Patterson had previously clarified in his original interview with me, and sunglasses. So these mysteries need to be uncovered in a full investigation. But what did Kevin McPadden hear on the radio held in the hands of a Red Cross worker before he heard these explosions, immediately before he heard these explosions?
At the last few seconds, he took his hand off, and you heard 3, 2, 1.
What? Do fires bring buildings down to countdowns? Something else is going on here. I mean, we got to get to the bottom of it. What did Jane Stanley announce 20 minutes before the collapse of this building?
Now, more on the latest building collapse in New York. You might have heard a few moments ago, I was talking about the Salomon Brothers building collapsing. And indeed it has. Apparently that's only a few hundred yards away from where the World Trade Center towers were. And it seems that this was not a result of a new attack. It was because the building had been weakened during this morning's attacks. We'll probably find out more now about that from our correspondent, Jane Stanley. Jane, what more can you tell us about the Salomon Brothers building and its collapse?
Well, only really what you already know. Details are very, very sketchy.
Sketchy indeed. There's the building still standing behind her. They've announced the collapse by fire, essentially. They said due to actually what they said was due to the weakening when the Twin Towers came down, which is interesting also. Yet another reason Building 7 came down. So all of these mysteries need much further investigation, although we do have the announce of a collapse of a 50-story building at 11:07 that morning, which is fascinating.
In New York, Alan Dodd-Frank joins us on the phone in Lower Manhattan. Alan?
Aaron, just 2 or 3 minutes ago, there was yet another collapse or explosion. I'm now out of sight. A Good Samaritan has taken me in on Duane Street. But at 11:15, there was another collapse or explosion following the 10:30 collapse of the second tower. And a firefighter who rushed by estimated that 50 stories went down. The street filled with smoke. It's like a forest fire roaring down a canyon. Now, as I think Patty Sabga and others have told you, all of Manhattan is covered, downtown Manhattan is covered with thick white ash.
Well, that thick white ash would have been suspended in the air 15 minutes after the towers came down. Was Building 7 supposed to go down at that time? Because there's no other 50-story building that went down. There's no other building that went down. There were buildings that were damaged. So had that building gone down at that time, we would have no visual record of it. And so many 9/11 researchers suggest that it was supposed to go down at that time and that it was a dud, and that those mysterious construction workers that we earlier heard talking about the building blowing up were fixing it. How else would they know? And that the time was given, around 5 o'clock by others. So there's abundant evidence of foreknowledge in this building's collapse. Certainly, the Building 7 would have been obscured by all of these dust clouds. And so what does Larry Silverstein, the owner of Building 7 and the developer of it in the 80s, have to say a year later, after 9/11, on PBS America Rebuilds and is referring to the collapse of Building 7.
I remember getting a call from the fire department commander telling me that they were not sure they were going to be able to contain the fire. And I said, you know, we've had such terrible loss of life. Maybe the smartest thing to do is pull it. And they made that decision to pull, and then we watched the building collapse.
They made the decision to pull, and we watched the building collapse. Well, firefighters don't pull buildings. And nobody goes into a building when it's on fire and sets explosive charges. So this must have been planned way in advance. What did the experts say?
Danny Jowenko is the expert on this in Europe. What did he say?
Dit is controlled demolition. Zeker weten. Zeker weten. Er is nagesprongen. Dit is in opdracht gebeurd. Het heeft een team gedaan van experts.
Team of experts did this. It's a controlled demolition. Same with more than 24 structural engineers signed on to the petition demanding a new investigation into the destruction of all 3 World Trade Center skyscrapers on 9/11. Kamal Obeid says a localized failure in a steel frame building like WTC 7 cannot cause a catastrophic collapse like a house of cards without a simultaneous and patterned loss of several of its columns at key locations within the building. That's pretty specific. Well, another structural engineer, one of the top forensic structural engineers in the country, Professor Leroy Hulsey of the University of Alaska at Fairbanks, was engaged in a 4-year, $300,000 study of how this building collapsed. Because let's face it, if a building like pretty common structure of this type, there's hundreds of them throughout the US. If they can come down now in 7 seconds due to normal office fires, we have a problem, right? So this has to be studied. So he engaged with his PhD students in detailing, inputting the building and modeling it with the fires that NIST said were raging in the northeast corner. And what would the structure do in response to the fire? How would it behave? They used the same input data that they had available from NIST. And they produced the computer model on the left, Alaska at Fairbanks, which very similarly mimics the behavior of the video of the building's collapse in the center. Compare that to the completely incongruous modeling of NIST on the right, where the east third of the building is falling apart inside at free fall acceleration, but the rest of the building is holding together but crumpling and begins to tip over. And it stops after 2 seconds. So they don't even show us what happens. They took years and years for this model. Well, if they showed us what happened, they would have shown it tipping over, which is what it certainly begins to do. So they can't even fake the free fall symmetrical collapse of Building 7. And it's pretty bad. So what did the University of Alaska find? Fire did not cause the collapse of Building 7. The temperatures were not high enough to cause the weakening of the steel framing. The thermal expansion did not result in loss of support for the beams and girders. And the building didn't experience a progressive collapse as claimed by NIST. It was actually a global collapse caused by the near simultaneous failure of all of its columns. Well, needless to say, that completely pulls the rug out from underneath the NIST report, which is why this landmark forensic finite element analysis of this high-rise did not receive any attention in the mainstream media, though it should have been throughout it as well as academic universities all around the world. So it's been snubbed, like this entire message has been snubbed effectively at higher levels of awareness and educating the public en masse. Feature number 9. Do we have persistent extreme heat and molten steel or iron? Well, let's ask the question, is there any evidence of ignited incendiaries, in this case thermite, from official sources? Yeah. FEMA provides the Building Performance Assessment Team report in May of 2002. It's in their Appendix C of this document. A metallurgical examination of what? The steel. What did they find? Never before observed eutectic reactions causing intergranular melting capable of turning a solid steel girder into Swiss cheese, like this piece of World Trade Center 7 steel. Fires don't do this to steel, normal office fires. And again, there was no jet fuel in this building because there's no plane that hit it, but we'll get to jet fuel in a moment. Rapid oxidation, sulfidation, liquid iron, that's molten iron. That's 2,800 degrees before a steel even begins, a piece of steel begins to melt. How do we achieve these temperatures? Office fires are typically only 500-600 degrees Fahrenheit. Sulfur formed during this hot corrosion attack on the steel. No clear explanation for the source of sulfur. This is pretty darn interesting, but guess what? It takes 4,000 degrees to evaporate steel, because the author of this report, Jonathan Barnett, says steel members in the debris pile appear to have been partly evaporated in extraordinarily high temperatures. So, my gosh, what do we find? What does Abulhassan Astani Azal, a structural engineer, given complete access to the landfill to study the steel with a National Science Foundation grant, what does he find? He finds that he saw a melting of girders at the World Trade Center. Well, he did. This is a piece of World Trade Center 7 steel also. It's melted. He doesn't know how it melted. He doesn't speculate. He's certainly curious. But he says it must have happened down in the pile. He doesn't know. He's just speculating. But we can see the temperature of these molten metals falling out of the debris held in the crab claw excavator. We know what the temperature is by the color. That's the physics of molten steel or iron. We're exceeding 2,500 degrees here. There's no accounting in the official narrative of these temperatures or these colors of molten steel or iron. They don't even speculate. They don't talk about it. They sweep it under the rug. This is 4 times the likely temperatures of the normal office fires that NIST says brought this building down. Where can they come from? Not from jet fuel, which this building, again, wasn't even hit by a plane. But even over at the World Trade Center, we know from ME Petroleum, the manufacturer of most of the jet fuel, we have burning 600 degrees maximum in open air. It's essentially kerosene. It requires a fine-tuned jet engine to make it hotter than that. Well, is there any evidence of something that can get hotter than that in the dust? Well, the U.S. Geological Survey finds it in all their World Trade Center studies of the dust. They published it in 2005, the Particle Atlas of the World Trade Center dust. What do they find? Billions of what? Previously molten, meaning exceeding 2,800 degrees. Iron, we haven't used iron in our skyscrapers for 100 years. Where does the iron come from? This is elemental iron. Spheres. How do they get spherical? Let's break this down. Up to 6% of these samples were previously molten iron microspheres, amounting to about 4 tons throughout all the World Trade Center dust. 4 tons. This is not from the welders doing their welding, putting the building together, or the iron workers taking it down. They're so ubiquitous that they're used as a signature component by the EPA to distinguish the World Trade Center dust from common office building dust. It's not even World Trade Center dust unless it has these billions of previously molten iron microspheres throughout all of it. And we don't even know what they are, but they're a signature component. Well, where do they come from? Here's a thermite experiment, which ejects thousands of what look like sparks, but which cool and fall into the pan as molten iron or previously molten iron microspheres. They get to be spherical because that's what the surface tension does to aerosolized liquids. That's what raindrops are. They're spheres. Could that be what can account for the toasting of the tops of these cars in this extreme high heat event? There's no other accounting for this in the official narrative. Well, if that was all evidence of ignited thermite, and it can only be that, is there any evidence of unignited thermite found in the World Trade Center dust? Well, a team of 8 international scientists led by Niels Harrit in Copenhagen collect 7 samples independently sent to them by others who had heard about their work in this field, including from the apartment of Jeanette McKinley, who lived across Liberty Street from the South Tower. All their windows blew in to the incredible explosiveness that we'll be taking a look at in a few minutes. But in all the samples, they find what look like paint chips. They're red on one side, gray on the other, dual layered chips. But they're attracted by a magnet. So we have a high iron content. Well, that's interesting. They get real curious and they say, well, what's with this red layer? With X-ray energy dispersive spectroscopy, they find the iron and aluminum in the red layer. Those are the ingredients of thermite that are not found together in paint chips. So now they get real curious. What are the ingredients of thermite doing in the World Trade Center dust? Well, they get real into it with a nuclear microscope and zoom in 50,000 times. And what do they find? Rhomboidal-shaped iron oxide crystals and aluminum platelets 1,000 times smaller than the diameter of a human hair. Nanoparticles. Wow. Why do we have nanoparticles of the ingredients of thermite set in a matrix of oxygen, silica, and carbon, which is organic material that expands? It's used in TNT to expand rapidly with the gases that are formed and knock things over. That's how high energy explosives work. Whereas thermite, an incendiary, normally works by means of extreme heat, achieving 4,000 degree temperatures. Well, what happens when they put these chips in? Well, a heater, a differential scanning calorimeter, like Lawrence Livermore did prior to 2001, and determined that this substance, which they invented, called super thermite, ignites at about 850 degrees Fahrenheit. Well, that's exactly what these 4 chips did when they put them in a differential scanning calorimeter this team of 8 scientists studying the World Trade Center dust. They ignite at the same temperature in an exothermic reaction, proving that this is not paint. This is much more engineered material than paint. What do you think what happens when the chip ignites? It produces what? Molten iron microspheres with the same chemical signature as the molten iron microspheres produced by the original event and studied by studied by the U.S. Geological Survey and by R.J. Lee, an environmental consulting group that independently corroborated the presence of these spheres, and that said that they were formed during the event, not before, not afterward, but during. So we have corroboration of what this stuff is, what it produces, so we know exactly where those spheres came from. They came from these chips, as if we didn't know. They're found attached to partially ignited red grade chips, as you see here and here. So it's very sophisticated material. It's not made in a cave in Afghanistan. This is made only in the most advanced defense contracting laboratories. So we can get a real clue here about what brought the Trade Center towers down. The evidence all adds up. We just need a real criminal investigation or a real journalistic investigation with people who are not afraid to track these things down. This is all documented in a 25-page peer-reviewed paper in the Bentham Open Chemical Physics Journal. They concluded the red layer is active, unreacted, thermitic material incorporating nanotechnology, and it's a highly energetic pyrotechnic or explosive material. So you can download this. It was published in 2009. We've given it to every congressman, 435 of them. We've also given them the petition. We've also given them our documentary, 9/11, Explosive Evidence, Experts Speak Out. We've given them this presentation, which concludes that we have all 10 key characteristic features of controlled demolition and some very uncharacteristic features as well involving incendiaries. It is direct evidence of destruction with incendiaries and or explosives. Fire doesn't create any one of these features, let alone all of them. With additional circumstantial corroborative evidence and testimony, this becomes proof, a body of proof that has convinced more than 3,600 architects and engineers to sign on to the petition demanding a new investigation. You can see that petition at Richard Gage, 911.org, along with those documentaries. And this one that we're making now, because we've already submitted 60 exhibits through the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry to the U.S. Attorney in Manhattan, Southern District. And so with that, we are following that up with this film series, about 24 episodes altogether that will be given to the grand jury for a special grand jury investigation. So we're very excited about that and invite you to co-produce that film. It becomes really important because it not only has the evidence of Building 7, but the Twin Towers. And we looked at the Twin Towers because we found that if Building 7 was a controlled demolition, then we owe it to ourselves to find out if the Twin Towers were as well. They're all part of the same event. They're part of the same conspiracy. So is there a conspiracy at the World Trade Center towers? Is there evidence of explosive destruction? Well, just look at the towers themselves. Here coming down, the North and South Tower shown together, though in reality they're 15 minutes apart. But comparing them, you can see upward, outward, arching streamers a geometry of fireworks, freely flying molten steel structure trailed by thick white smoke clouds. Yeah, you're darn right. We got to go into it and look hard. And we did, representing those 3,600 architects and engineers. And what did we find? We found that, again, similarities and differences with controlled demolition. Let's start with a sudden onset. Here's a similarity. The building, the North Tower, is still, and all of a sudden, excuse me, it's in uniform downward motion. No jolt, no hesitation upon impact of the cold, hard steel below. How about the South Tower? It's still, and all of a sudden, uniform downward motion, as we'll see, almost free fall acceleration. Now, NIST has a theory in their 10,000 page final report that the upper part drove above the point of jet plane impacts, drove the rest of the building down to the ground at free fall, and then destroyed itself. This is called the crush down, crush up theory. It was provided to us by Zdeněk Bazant from Chicago, Northwestern University in Chicago. He provided an extremely complex paper that's taken engineers 10 years to decode. He calls it the crush down, crush up paper. All the rest of us after 9/11 were freaked out, not knowing when the next attack would come. Who's doing this to us? This guy's in his den creating the mathematical wizardry of the century, covering up the crime of the century, and submits this 2 days after 9/11. Excuse me.
Wow.
So that's incredible. Obviously, this was worked on prior to 9/11. Can we prove that? I can't. But what is the theory? That the upper part drove the rest of the building down to the ground. But wait, what about Newton's third law of motion? There's an equal and opposite destructive force when two bodies collide. How about a Volkswagen and a Mack truck? Does it matter if we drop the Volkswagen onto the Mack truck? No, the Volkswagen is not going to destroy the Mack truck. The lightest part of a structure cannot destroy the cold, hard, intact steel below it. At the top, we have the lightest columns and structure. As you go down, they get heavier and heavier and heavier and heavier until mid-height, you've got 36 inches by 16 inches, 2-inch thick columns. But they get heavier and heavier below that till they're almost solid steel, 52 inches by 22 inches at the bottom. The upper story is going to destroy all of that? No. And guess what? It's not. We can see plainly that the upper story is destroyed in the first couple of seconds. Let me make it easier for you. Watch the red line at the bottom. It's not moving down. The Volkswagen is not destroying the Mack truck below. It's being destroyed by itself before there's any movement. What's destroying it? We'll come to that. If there was an upper part destroying the lower part, we would see it. But none of the photos, none of the videos show an upper part driving down the rest of the building. After a couple of seconds, in fact, what we see again is upward, outward arching streamers, a geometry of fireworks, freely flying molten solid objects trailed by thick white smoke clouds. Think about this. Looks more like the volcanic eruption in the Tongan Sea. Why are the ends of columns on fire? That doesn't happen in office fire. They're not flammable like a wood structure would be. The steel is not flammable unless it's packed with pre-placed shaped cutter charges using thermite, for instance. That would cause the ends of the beams to be molten and trail thick white smoke clouds, which are aluminum oxide ash, which is the second byproduct of thermite. That's why we see what we're seeing here in this photograph. And if the upper part were there, it would have destroyed this section of core columns that remain for about 7 seconds after the destruction of the building. It would have crushed it, right? So, and we can see then this isn't turning to dust as claimed by those supporting directed energy weapons. It has another blast from down below, and then it drops frame by frame. You can see the top of that steel column dropping through the concrete powder, which has been shaken off of the structure. So it's not this that we're seeing, it's this. The building is blowing out after the first 4 seconds around the core structure, inadvertently leaving some of it for that final collapse piece. What would be causing that? Well, let's listen to 186 first responders orally recorded in the month following 9/11 by the fire department. Graham McQueen, professor at McMaster University, read 12,000 pages of testimony, and he's now found 186 eyewitnesses. Let's listen. We felt the ground shake. You could see the tower sway, and then it just came down. So again and again, we're going to see the specific order of events here. They're seeing something, feeling something, hearing something, and then the tower comes down. All of a sudden, the ground just started shaking. Felt like a train running under my feet. The next thing we know, we look up, and the tower is collapsing. Shook my bones. Shortly before the first tower came down, I remember feeling the ground shaking, heard a terrible noise, and then debris just started flying everywhere. I saw flash, flash, flash at the lower level of the building, you know, like when they demolish a building. With each popping sound, it was initially an orange and then a red flash that came out of the building. Then it would just go all around the building on both sides. Saw a number of brief light sources being emitted from inside the building between floors 10 and 15. He saw about 6 of these brief flashes, accompanied by a crackling sound before the tower collapsed. I saw low-level flashes. I saw flash, 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 and then it looked like the building came down. You ever see professional demolition where they set charges on certain floors and you hear the pop, pop, pop? When I heard that friggin' noise, that's when I saw the building coming down. An explosion appeared at the very top. Simultaneously, from all 4 sides, material shot out horizontally. And then there seemed to be a momentary delay before you could see the beginning of the collapse. There was an explosion in the South Tower, one floor under another. When it hit about the 5th floor, I figured it was a bomb because it looked like a synchronized, deliberate kind of thing. Seemed like on television when they blow up all these buildings, seemed like going all the way around like a belt. All these explosions. The building was blowing out on all 4 sides. We actually heard the pops. You know, you heard the pops of the building. I thought the terrorists planted explosives somewhere in the building. That's how loud it was, a crackling explosive. Another loud boom at the upper floors. Then there was a series of smaller explosions which appeared to go completely around the building at the upper floors. And another loud earth-shattering blast with a large fireball that blew out more debris. The lower level of the building, you know, like when they demolished the building, that's what I thought I saw. You see any flashes? I said, yes. I thought it was just me. He said, no, I saw them too. Everybody at this point everybody I think at that point still thought that these things were blown up. So I was fully expecting anything else to blow up. You were there when the planes hit? I said, no, I was there when the building exploded. You mean when it fell down? No, when it exploded. Well, how many of those witnesses, or the 186 that I didn't read, do you imagine NIST included in their final report that came out in 2002? Or was
Not
it
many.
2000? Zero. Not one. They claim to have interviewed 116 first responders. They missed all the most important ones because that testimony is the most important of all. So, does the building come straight down? Let's look at the South Tower. Interestingly, it begins to fall over. So it has asymmetrical damage from this piece that's falling off at 22 degrees, asymmetrical damage from the fires up above, asymmetrical damage from the airplanes. How in the world then do we get complete symmetrical damage all the way around each face of this building? Falling or traveling down the building almost at free fall acceleration. Well, let's zoom in and see what we can learn from this leading corner of this destruction. I don't know what you see, Ryan, but I see independent explosions, at least a dozen of them in this looped video, including the isolated one below there.
Yeah.
This is not a nuclear weapon going off, as some have alleged. This is not directed energy weapons. These are individual pre-placed explosives that are exploding at this time, blowing out the core columns, the perimeter columns all the way down the building. And we can see these very clearly in these isolated explosive ejections, like you see 20 stories down here, below 40 stories down below the zone of destruction. These isolated explosive ejections called squibs, even 60 stories down below the zone of destruction. There's no accounting for these in the official narrative, and they're not in the official narrative whatsoever in the form of the final NIST report. Here in the South Tower, we can begin to understand what's happening in the South Tower as we see on the left side a dozen independent isolated explosions, squibs, which are deductively, we can understand that they're destroying the internal structure of the upper section here, such that it doesn't maintain its rigidity and act off the rigidity of the structure below and continue to fall off. It actually settles back in place, having its structure essentially been liquefied. So we know now that this is not what they told us. It's not an apple, i.e. a progressive collapse of this building. It's an orange, a series of explosions, which can result in the other phenomena here of how fast it's coming down, almost free fall acceleration, 2/3 of free fall acceleration. It's not decelerating. It's not slowing down. It's getting faster and faster, as measured in this case by David Chandler, physics teacher. And what he's showing us is that 90% of the structure had to have been removed in order for it to fall at 2/3 of free fall acceleration. You can see his website, 911speakout.org, for additional information. But look, how can it go faster and faster and faster every second through this structure? There's more steel than glass on the outside of this structure. It's 20 times stronger than it needed to be to support the gravity loads, according to the structural engineer, because they have to design these structures to resist hurricanes. So this Varandale truss is incredibly designed. They were very nervous about this building being blown over because the face of it is essentially a huge sail absorbing incredible forces from the wind. So it had to go down through all of that, and the interior core columns as well, 47 massive core columns. And how did that happen? Well, we get another clue here with the lateral ejection of the steel. The sent outward with an incredible force, 4 and 8 ton structural steel sections ejected laterally at 80 miles an hour, clocked by physicists, landing 600 feet in every direction, impaling themselves in the skyscrapers all around them. This is not a progressive gravity-driven collapse. How does gravity work? Down. Well, we can see that they're freely flying, so they're not peeling off like a banana peel off of this structure as claimed by some, but outward. Look at this one. Outward, back 2, forward 2, back 2. That's horizontal. What force is required to send a 4-ton structural steel section horizontally? And then gravity begins to take over and we get a 45-degree angle of fall before this one actually looks like it's hitting World Trade Center 7. There's enough force there to hurl a 200-pound cannonball 3 miles. That's a lot of force. And it's a 1,200-foot to 1,400-foot diameter. The building's only 207 feet wide. Most of that steel should have landed down on top of the pile, but it wasn't. It was delivered outward beyond the site of the World Trade Center, impacting Building 7 on the north, as you can see up here.
Yeah.
Now, if 100,000 tons of steel framing is distributed outside the tower's footprint, we got to ask ourselves, what's crushing the building? The steel is not the steel. Only maybe 2% of the steel is at the bottom. The rest of it is well outside, so it couldn't have crushed. We saw it was freely flying, externally ejected. So hardly any of that steel was available to crush it. Maybe it was the concrete, because there were 110 floors of concrete. And in fact, they're each an acre in size, 4 inches thick and 8 inches thick concrete poured over metal decking, over lightweight steel joists. We should see a pancake, a set of pancakes, 110 of them, badly broken up like you see on the right in a real gravitational collapse in Mexico. We don't see 50. We don't see 10. We don't see 1. Where are they? Where did the concrete go? It's missing. Oh, there it is, Ryan. The concrete is pulverized at the top of the building and on down, and in midair, distributed again laterally across lower Manhattan in a cloud of concrete dust, 90,000 tons of it from each building, pulverized to 100 micron particles on average. That's like baby powder. Incredible set of explosives to do that. And laid like a blanket, 3 inches thick across a 3 square mile area of lower Manhattan from river to river. Well, if that's true, and it obviously is, what's crushing the building? It wasn't the steel, which is easily half the weight of the building. And it's not the concrete, which is almost the other half. That's most all the weight of the building. But guess what? Zdenek Bazant from Northwestern University used all of that weight to crush the building below it. Not only all of that weight in this piece of wizardry paper that took engineers so long, 10 years to decode, but they doubled the mass up above when they finally decoded it. They found that they fraudulently doubled it. Well, they fraudulently used it in the first place, the steel and the concrete weight. They fraudulently doubled it, and they fraudulently decreased the column strength below by a factor of 3. They rigged the whole thing in favor of a collapse. And this has now been made public. In fact, it's been submitted to the American Society of Civil Engineers Journal of Engineering Mechanics, but they said, no, we're not going to publish it. Why? It's out of scope. They said, well, how can it be out of scope to publish a paper that shows the flaws in a previously published paper in the same journal? That's the whole point of scientific research and peer-reviewed papers. Well, that's under a lawsuit at this point. So we have an interesting coincidence here. How could those thermite or explosives be put into the building? Could liquid applied nanothermite have been applied during the fireproofing upgrades, which interestingly were coincidental with the point of plane impacts, which were different in each tower? So this is put together by Kevin Ryan at digwithin.net, an important set of resources, as is the Journal of 9/11 Studies. So what about the evidence? What does it show? Well, we don't know, really, because in easily the largest and most perplexing structural failures in history, we have 400 truckloads a day, starting just 2 weeks after 9/11, being carted from the site to the landfill, then put on barges and sent to China for recycling before investigators could get their hands on it and do a proper forensic examination of the steel. This is the illegal destruction of evidence in a crime scene, prompting Bill Manning, editor-in-chief of Fire Engineering magazine, to cry out, crucial evidence that could answer many questions is on the slow boat to China, showing an astounding ignorance of government officials to the value of a thorough scientific investigation. The destruction and removal of evidence must stop immediately. But it didn't. And with all of this evidence together, the 10 key characteristic and some very uncharacteristic features of controlled demolition, fire not being able to account for any one of these features, this is direct evidence of destruction with explosives and incendiaries. With additional circumstantial corroborative evidence and testimony that we have in our 5-hour program of webinars on this subject, we find that to be proof of controlled demolition, as do more than 3,600 architects and engineers who signed the petition publicly demanding a new investigation. And many of them appear in the film series that we are making. We filmed it already in Washington, D.C. Mick Harrison, the litigation director for 9/11 Inquiry, Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry, and I filmed it, and we filmed a couple of dozen of these experts. We're now in post-edit. We're editing it, and we're going to get it out the first episode this month. So we've got an opportunity for you to help co-produce the film for us. Please get involved in the film. Visit richardgage911.org and find out how you can co-produce, and get yourself informed too, because we've got the documentary, 9/11 Explosive Evidence Experts Speak Out. The story of Professor Leroy Halsey at the University of Fairbanks in the DVD called 7. You can watch that. And the 15-minute documentary on Building 7 narrated by actor Ed Asner that I made for PBS television. It is really good. So highly recommended. You can download and print the brochure, which has the outline of evidence that we've been talking about today. Because why? Brown University has done an excellent job actually giving us the dark news about what happened following 9/11. 1 million deaths in Afghanistan and Iraq, maybe 2 million. 38 million refugees, 7,000 US soldiers killed, 30,000 of them committing suicide, 2 trillion on the care of the veterans coming home from that war, 14 trillion spent on the longest war in American history in Afghanistan to secure what? Not the arrest of Osama bin Laden, but the production and processing and distribution of opium, where 90% of the world's supply came from, until the Taliban shut it down after we were kicked out last year, 2 years ago. The post 9/11 wars, 8 trillion. The cost is enormous for these adventures of the deep state that we, the American people and people all around the world, are dragged into. So the truth is just much darker than we have been allowed to see by the controlled mainstream media. We've got to wake up. It's really important. We've got the Patriot Act, the Military Commissions Act, the National Defense Authorization Act of 2012, which stripped our civil liberties, paving the way for COVID and the false disease and the false solution to it, which is even darker, actually, than 9/11. So, yes, we have huge problems. We've got to draw our line in the sand somewhere. Where do you draw it? I drew it in 2006 when I said, no more. These are buildings. I'm an architect. I can't sidestep this one. So I've been speaking about it for 18 years in 24 countries and doing more than 700 presentations and an equal number of radio and TV interviews. So that's what I can do. What can you do? All you have to do is not nothing, right? You can take this podcast from Ryan Donnelly and send it to every architect and engineer you know, everybody else. In fact, representatives from the media, your elected representatives, friends, colleagues, co-workers. You know, we may just be a small piece of the puzzle, but if we get started, look what can happen.
Boom. That was 13 dominoes. If I had 29 dominoes, the last domino would be as tall as the Empire State Building.
And that's the deep state that we are after. So let's get started. If 2 of you send this out, I mean, all of you, send it out to 2 people, just 2 people, and ask them to share it also. Look what can happen. The magnification of our efforts are astronomical. Do your part. Really, really important. Don't let your friends, your colleagues, your neighbors be the last to know. And don't wait for them to ask you, why didn't you tell me? Well, I was afraid of being called a conspiracy theorist. No, those days are over. We're out of time, my friend. We're really out of time. It's time to act. Don't you agree, Ryan?
I sure do, Richard. And wow, I'm like, I have the chills from going through that. You know, this stuff isn't particularly new to me, having been familiar with your work and the work of a lot of other people who have investigated this. But I guess reliving it again through that presentation was absolutely chilling and caused a stirring within me where I feel exactly what you said. Time is of the essence. 9/11 sent us on a trajectory towards, forever wars, and things aren't getting any better, right? I mean, we look at, present day now in Gaza, the destruction and genocide of the Palestinians, and it's not just there, Ukraine, you name it, and we're gearing up for, conflict with China as well. So it seems like conflict is completely on the horizon, and I think, as you've suggested, that uncovering the truth about 9/11 would be maybe a meaningful first step, or if not a first step, a meaningful step towards stopping the momentum of these endless wars that jeopardize the human existence on this planet.
And they all seem to be started by false flag events, even in Gaza. We've proven that, and many others have proven that this was a false flag operation, that Hamas was set up decades ago by the conservative party and the Mossad in Israel, and encouraged and paid to flourish as a foil against Arafat. And so the Mossad had their operatives in there. They knew exactly what was going to happen on October 7th. In fact, they knew a year before. According to the New York Times, they had the game plan, which was blown open by the New York Times. And so we know that there's a penetration of 20 points of the most secure wall in history anywhere in the world. And we know there's a delay in response for 7 hours. So it's very clear what's going on. They needed Hamas to, and whoever else was infiltrated in Hamas to do these killings, to act up and then exaggerate in those atrocities that were alleged. In fact, most of the killings were done by the Apache helicopters, because every car was hit almost by them. And most of those cars, of course, had no Hamas in them. They were at the concert party or whatever it was. So it goes on and on and on, all of this proof. You can see the documentary by Mr. Hankey, which we posted on our Substack, Richard Gage 9/11 at substack.com. Well, Richard Gage 911.substack.com. There we go.
There we go. Yeah, I mean, Richard, I don't know how much time you have, and you've already been super generous with your time. If you have another minute or two, I would love to just comment about the false flags in general. Like, this isn't a new thing, right? Like, I mean, if we go back to the people have suggested Pearl Harbor, there was foreknowledge of it. The Gulf of Tonkin incident with Vietnam. The Joint Chiefs even presented John F. Kennedy a plan called Operation Northwoods that involved blowing up a commercial airliner and blaming it on Cuba to justify an invasion of Cuba of some sort. So this is kind of the standard, not the exception. Would you agree?
Yeah, it is a long line of false flag operations that have started virtually every war that we have been in. We actually started or provoked, in the case of Japan, particularly by blockading them, doing an oil embargo on them while they're trying to fight a war in the East. So we know also that COVID was a false flag operation. We've identified that as well in the 2-hour presentation that I gave on that subject, the astounding parallels between 9/11 and COVID. And that's on our website, richardgage911.org. And you'll find, for instance, that there were patents on the disease as well as the vaccine well before the disease ever came out, years before. Dr. David Martin exposes this quite handily. We know that they exaggerated the number of deaths and the number of cases incredibly so. They exaggerated the number of deaths to 1 million when, in fact, it was far fewer than that. And they de-emphasized the deaths caused by the vaccine that they, I'll put it in quotes, vaccine, because it's not a vaccine and it's not safe and it's not effective. And even the VAERS system shows that there's 30,000 adverse events, and the deaths alone are astronomical compared to other vaccines, and yet they never stopped it. Well, the VAERS system only shows 1%, as proven by a study that the CDC themselves sponsored to determine how effective is the VAERS system. Well, they found that only 1% of doctors or patients go through the incredible hoops to report an injury or death. I mean, if you were a doctor, would you want to report a death that you may be responsible for by giving somebody a vaccination? No, it's voluntary. So yeah, that is just the beginning of the nightmares of COVID and its false solution that we go into step by step. In fact, let me just name the actual set of parallels between 9/11, as we've discussed, and COVID. Foreknowledge, where there's insider trading. Predictive programming, foreknowledge. Drills, foreknowledge. Abuse of science, creating a climate of fear. A solution that's far worse than the original problem. We just talked about that. False official accounts by officials. Extreme control of the narrative. No real investigation. An elusive, powerful enemy. Control of information and a shifting narrative by top agencies and NGOs. Media censorship and attacks on critical questioning. Implementation of draconian policies and surveillance. So that's what we go into in that 2-hour presentation. I encourage everybody to watch it.
Well, I will encourage everybody to watch it as well. It seems that we're up against quite a power structure, but as the domino video you showed at the end of the presentation really illustrated, it doesn't take much for a grassroots effort to start and spread and to counteract, this top-down draconian enterprise that we find ourselves surrounded with, and that seems to be driving humanity to the brink of extinction. So, I thank you tremendously and with my full heart for doing what you do, for coming on here today. Gosh, I could talk your ear off all day, but I won't do that to you. You've been so generous with your time. And thank you for the presentation. As people who watch the show know, typically it's a dialogue. We're going back and forth, but what you've put together about 9/11, I feel is so deeply important that I'm tremendously grateful you were able to go through your slides, go through the videos, go through the copious amounts of evidence to really educate myself and the folks who are going to watch this. I think that it's only through efforts like yours and people spreading the word that we have a chance to stop the negative momentum in society. So, Richard, let me just, again, thank you very much for being here, doing what you're doing. Thank your wife, Bill, for her efforts and, being by your side to get the word out. And yes, I encourage everybody who watched this to go out, support Richard, become a producer for the film coming out, and go to his website and all the various links that he mentioned to find out more information and educate yourself on these various topics.
Agreed. And thank you, Ryan, so much for having the platform and pushing it out there, and all the work that you do too. Many other issues people need to be aware of, and you're covering them all. I'm just covering one of them. So thank you.
Yeah, not a problem at all. Well, I will leave it at that and say thanks again. And I hope that we cross paths again. And I hope that the next time we do cross paths, humanity's on a slightly more positive trajectory. But until then, You take care, and thanks again for joining.
Crossing my fingers. All right. You take care too.